Greetings, YouTube! It's been 2 weeks since my WIXOSS tutorial went up. Honestly, I wanted to have videos like this out a long time ago, but it's really hard to find people to try out my new games. I was able to collect some data though, and I'd like to go over it. I'm going to give each of the 3 trial decks their own separate video later, but for right now, since it's been so long, I'd like to do just a quick overview of all 3 decks, what I think of them, and how I think they stack up to one another. So without further ado, let's get to the decks. First thing I want to get out of the way is, yes, all 3 decks are viable. This is a fairly exceptional case, as most of the time when a card game is just starting out, they come out with starter decks that don't really balance up to one another. It's almost always the case that one deck is either so much more powerful than the other decks that it's the only deck anybody ever buys, or one of the decks is so much weaker than the other decks that nobody ever uses it. But each deck in WIXOSS comes with a basic toolbox of cards that every deck has access to, and then it kind of branches off into its own deck from there. For example, every deck has vanillas at 1, 2, and 3 that have the exact same power as vanillas from the other sets. Well, every deck has 4 copies of a level 1 that's 3000 power. But in addition to that, white also has a level 1 that lets it control its draws, red has a level 1 that lets it control the field, and blue has a level 1 that lets it draw and discard a card to control their hands. So really there isn't a wrong choice right now. If there's a deck that you have your eye on that you want to get, then go ahead and get it. I will say though that each deck does play a little bit differently, so if you happen to want a deck that is outside of your playstyle, then you might want to either change your playstyle or look at a different deck. For this video, I've compiled a small bullet point list for 5 pros and 5 cons of each deck. If you're still kind of on the fence about which deck you want to get, or you want to know a little more about the deck that you're going to get before you actually get it, then watch the rest of this video and see for yourself what my experiences with the decks have been so far. The white deck is a very nice mixture of control and aggro. Get, Bible, and Avon guarantee that your deck can always grab the Signy it needs for every situation. As far as the 3 trial decks go, Baroque Defense is the only card that can stop Lariggs from attacking, outside of normal guard cards. Armor and Helmet Romale is potentially the biggest Signy in the 3 trial decks. It can stand at 16,000 power during your opponent's turn if you can manage to get 2 in play. Because you draw 2 cards at the beginning of your turn, Rococo Boundary automatically wins the game if your opponent only has 1 life cloth left. You'll either draw Signy or cards that search for Signy. Because this opens up 2 spots, you can swing 1 at the open spot for the last life cloth and 1 at the last open spot for game. The only exceptions to this play are Baroque Defense and Don't Move, but those are very situational. Unfortunately, the deck has no real come from behind burst victory. The white deck is much more consistent than the other 2 decks, but if you're behind by a huge margin, it's a lot harder for this deck to come back than it is for the other 2 decks. You're either playing consistently or you're losing. While playing Get Bible is a great way to get any card you need, keeping it up early game puts you really behind in energy. You'll have access to any Signy in your deck that you'll ever need, but you'll also be much slower than your opponent if you have to do this in order to put your plays on. It's a trade-off. You're giving up speed for consistency. If Rococo Boundary doesn't win you the game, it will backfire. Opening up 2 of your opponent's spaces and giving them 2 more cards in hand is not a good thing. It might not seem like a big deal, but you really don't want to keep bouncing things that have on-play effects. Avon cannot search for cards with guard. At least not the ones that come in the trial deck. The effects of the 2 servants only activate when they're actually out of your deck, so you can't search for them. This isn't a super bad drawback, but it does take away what could have potentially been a really powerful play. While the deck does do a little bit of aggro and a little bit of control, it isn't as good at either of those 2 things as the other 2 decks. It's not as strong as the red deck, it's not as forceful as the blue deck. The deck's main strength is consistently grabbing the perfect card for the perfect situation. The white deck is for people who don't necessarily want to focus on aggro or control, but would rather adapt to whatever the opponent is playing. Go after the white deck if you're a jack of all trades. The red deck is hands down the best deck for beginners. It's the easiest deck to understand and use, and if you win consistently, you can sleep with your brother if you're into that kind of thing. Flame Vortex and Silkstone Volcano can both destroy level 4 Signy. So even if your opponent has a much better field than you, as long as you're controlling your energy, you can always come back and get rid of them anyway. Unless you're completely out of energy, there's nothing in the game you have to be afraid of. If you're the kind of player that can manage to save 6 cards in their hands, then this is the ultimate comeback card. Chances are, if you're in a position where you need to use Set Ablaze, you don't have any Signy in play anyway. Blow up your opponent's field, open up all 3 spaces, and then set 3 Signy and immediately swing for 3 Life Cloth. If your opponent only had 2 Life Cloth left, then this immediately wins you the game. The only exceptions are Baroque Defense and Don't Move. And these cards are, like I said before, very situational. Silkstone Volcano is the only level 1 that can potentially open up spaces. Both early game and late game, playing this card when your opponent has a 1000 in play guarantees you're getting at least 1 Life Cloth. With all of the field removal, Red can easily win the game by turn 4. Doing so requires some serious energy control and mastery of the deck, but it is the only deck that can pull off turn 4 wins consistently. When it comes to energy, this is the most expensive deck to play. Since Banished Signy become energy, improperly playing these cards will just put your opponent way farther ahead of you in energy. Not only does Blue's hand control make it impossible to play Set Blaze, but it really puts this deck back. This deck just cannot bounce back from not having a hand the same way that White can. If this deck isn't able to get a huge advantage early game, you're probably going to lose. The tricks that this deck has are great, but if you've used them all and your opponent still isn't on the verge of losing, then you've lost. This deck just cannot deal with late game. With a level 4 Hanayo, Silkstone Volcano can be a 14,000, but this effect only takes place during your turn. Silkstone Volcano does have an amazing on-play effect, but power-wise, this makes it the weakest of the level 4 Signy in the trial decks, as the other level 4 Signys are 14,000 during both players' turns. This deck suffers much more than the other two from a bad opening hand. Due to your reliance on early game aggression, not having a good opening hand is the reason why you will have lost a lot of your matches. The red deck is for people who don't need fancy tricks and just want to win through pure power. Pick red if you don't care what's on the field, it all burns the same. The blue deck is best for people who are veterans of other card games or want to take WIXOSS really seriously. Played correctly, this deck can make it almost impossible for your opponent to play. Blue is the only trial deck that can directly affect your opponent's hand size. This is extra useful because since the cards aren't already on the field and then banished, they go immediately to the discard pile. It doesn't give your opponent a bunch of energy like the red cards do. Due to this deck's hand control, it is easily the best deck for late game players. It is very difficult to beat a blue deck if the game lasts longer than turn 5. SMP and Peeping Analyze can be used specifically to target guard cards. By looking at your opponent's hand and discarding servant cards, this is the only deck that can get around guard. When it comes to energy costs, blue is definitely a lot cheaper than the other decks. Since you don't have to be that stingy with your energy, you get consistent level ups and can pull off a lot of really great plays. The Signy in the blue deck aren't particularly powerful. There's really no way to step over a powerful Signy your opponent already has in play. You have to get rid of them before they actually have a chance to play them. While the blue deck does have Don't Move, which stops attacks, it doesn't have a single card in it that clears up spaces on the field. Being the only deck that doesn't have a way to clear spaces, this deck cannot make a game-winning move. You have to just wear your opponent down. Peeping Analyze can cause some serious damage for your opponent, but it also has a chance of not doing anything at all. During the trial deck review, I'll give you some tips to use this card to its fullest. But keep in mind there is always a chance that this card will pop and not do a single thing. The blue level 4 Lurig and Signy combo is the only one with a condition. It's not necessarily difficult to get your opponent down to one card, but this is the only level 4 Lurig Signy combo where you have to do something in order to get the power boost. This deck is very punishing when it comes to making mistakes or not making optimal plays. This deck does not function properly in the hands of a casual player or somebody who doesn't know much about card games. I'm very sorry if you really want to play blue and you fall into one of those categories, but it just doesn't work very well. You're much better off going for one of the other decks. While not very easy to master, the blue deck can be the most difficult deck to fight. Pick the blue deck if strength doesn't matter to you. If your opponent doesn't have any arms, how can they hit you anyway? Thank you for watching my buyer's guide. If you enjoyed this video, then why not leave me a like? Likes really help us out. Have your own thoughts or want to point out something I might have missed, then leave it in the comments section below. And finally, subscribe to stay up to date on the latest Kudo news. Regardless of which deck you decide to get, you play it like a champ. I have to let you go today, but don't forget to tune in for my in-depth trial deck reviews. If you just can't get enough of my voice, then why not go check out my WIXOSS tutorial or some of the other videos on my channel. Until next time, happy gaming.